Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar on late season grazing, including crop residues, stockpile pastures, bales, and various annuals. My name is Dean Dick. I'm a farm management specialist at the Ag Info Center, and I'll be helping moderate this webinar. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started here. The first is that this webinar is being recorded, and you'll receive an email with a link to the recording in tomorrow's email. The second is, if you would like to ask a question, the best way to do it is to type in your question in the question box on your GoToWebinar panel. Because we have 4 presenters today, if you have a specific question for a specific speaker, then please note that and I can direct it that way. Otherwise, we'll just have the question and open the floor. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Grant Lestuca, our forage extension specialist with Alberta Agriculture and Forestry, to start the webinar. Grant.
Thank you, Dean. I hope I'm coming through loud and clear. We're quite excited about doing this as a team because this team has been present and active in the extending grazing season in many ways for a long time. And I'm going to start it off. Diane Westerlin from the Stockpile Research Association at Oyen has grabbed a couple of topics to handle and showcase some of the things that their producers are doing towards the Oyen area. So just some of them. And then Alyssa Krawchuk, we got to change her last name now. Congratulations to her. From the Lakeland Applied Research Association up there at Bonnyville is going to share what some of the work they've done, some of their producers are doing up there, splitting it up again. And then we're going to head up to the Peace Country, up to Manning, and an area where we still got a lot of crop in the field, and Nora Polovich from the North Peace Applied Research Association is going to also share some of the things they're doing up there. Of course, none of that is everything. We're just trying to split up the topics so you get a feel for what people are doing in different places. Extending the grazing season, something that really took off as a dilemma of a time at BSE. But it was also something that producers had been doing so often. As we just mentioned, when crops were left in the field, people started swath grazing. So where did some of this come from? The challenge with all of this is that it is a 365-day game. And as we look at it, every year is different. And we are trying to deal with those differences in ways, hopefully, that work. And many of you can see what you'd want to see in this picture and some things maybe that you don't. We always know that there are contingencies, need for other plans when winter hits at times because snow can stop. But at the same time, I know I've done presentations on extended grazing where in the same room somebody else has told me you can't do this here. And I have had, and it's been many times to be honest with you, so I know it's a fact, somebody else telling me how they did. So innovating. And you've got 3 forage and applied research associations that are teams here on this call to draw on after this event on how producers are making things work. And as one producer said, how are we stick handling through the options? The one thing I think we need to look back at is that it makes good sense to put up winter feed. That was in fact known. But history also tells us something that's intriguing. When you look at the Bayou Ranch and the sign down there, it talks about, south of Calgary, needing to put up feed for when cattle couldn't access it. Well, when you were doing with a team of horses, you didn't put up a lot of feed. When you started in using modern equipment, we can put up a lot of feed. And we've maybe dealt with our greatest weakness here in Canada by putting a lot of costs to deal with it. The fact is it costs money to put up good forage. It costs money to have forage available to you at times when you need it and you might not. So we're looking at it and saying, is it over $60 a ton? And I know that a lot of us have gone to the round bale wrapping and everything, and it does in many ways have many advantages. But yes, that's an example of something that does cost. And Karen Lindquist will be sharing a little more on this round bale silage later in another webinar, delivering it back out. The fact is, it's a commitment. It's another cost. And how much does it cost? Well, it depends how well the tractor runs, how well the truck runs, how many repairs, the mud in spring or whatever, or if it's used in both of these cases that we've got here, actually it was a supplement that was used with animals out on swaths or animals out on some pretty tough ground stockpile grazing. Our friends at Tomahawk, the Telus, made a good comment to me that I grabbed and took with it. It's a 365-day grazing mentality. It doesn't mean to say, Jerry, when he said that, didn't mean to say successful all the time, but it is a mentality and approach to consideration on focusing on what is probably the cow's greatest ability. How can she get feed for herself instead of us provide it to her? Let's make that strength last another month longer, another 2 months longer, another 3 months longer. And in so doing, instead of dwelling on our weakness, we run with our strengths and deal with our weakness in a way that's more cost effective. I've got to admit, when I look at extended grazing, the wildlife issues to me are the greatest one. I don't look at the snow and other things quite the same way as others maybe do. But the wildlife side of things can get to you. Certainly, we look to people that are dealing with it, and the Peace River Forage Associations of British Columbia has looked at 3D fencing and other things. So there are groups out there trying to deal with wildlife. But certainly there's some tricks. Cows do take more energy. Yes, them working for you. From that side, we also know we have to have the field set up. Where are we going to get our water from? We're going to deal with the cow in a way in which it's going to be most effective. Wonders of electric fencing, portable wind panels, other things. The weather risk for forage quality loss is present, but it really does vary. And the access to the forage is one of the things. The waste side's intriguing because we often find where we think the waste is high, and I think Alyssa is going to cover some of this, it might be not so great with a bit of skill. Anyway, it does require higher planning, management, monitoring, backup plans. No doubt about that, and that is crucial. We have a bunch of options open to us. What are the options? The options are varied for many different people. What is available to you in your community, in your land base, or in your neighbor's land base? And Nora might share something with us on that. But beyond that, what does our cow tell us is available? Where does she come into the picture? When is she calving? When are you weaning? Does it matter when you wean? Are you flexible? And the calving side of it, of course, means different requirements for cattle when they're calving a lot later, because the third trimester, the highest requirement time, as you can see in this scenario, is in April, in May. And with that gives us more opportunities at warmer weather, lower cost, addressing some of these things. We started in the 90s working on winter grazing at Lacombe, looking at the swath grazing with the Western Forage Beef Group. Dwayne McCartney led the charge, Dr. Vern Barron. And what we found there was exciting because beyond winter feeding, wow, 47% reduction in cost, but the labor side was 44% less. All of a sudden, people realized they could get their lives back too, and they weren't a dairy farmer in winter maybe. Nothing against dairy farmers, but they're committed. They could, in fact, work on their schedule a little bit more with the labor, timing as well. Maybe it was done on a bit of a weekend thing. But the cost savings of 70 cents per day back then, and you're saying, well, this is the 90s. Yes, I know, it is a long time ago. So let's explore this a little further. A number of the Forage and Applied Research Associations worked on this through the Agricultural Research and Extension Council of Alberta, called Year-Round Grazing 365 Days. What they found is, and all of this, take your cell phone, take a picture of it. This webinar is present for you to look at afterwards. So I'm covering this area, but I don't want to take away from all the other time that the other speakers have. Yardage. You can see the difference in yardage costs back then in 2000. And with the different options where the savings potentially could be. We looked at it from a total cost. In that publication I talked to you, Haven Zettel was the Erica publication, and Amber Havens led our charge, and looking at grazing alternatives over 200 days. As you can see in the green, cost per day, that is a lot of lower cost in a straw chaff versus bale grazed and versus traditional. But today's numbers, when we look at work Dr. Vern Barron had done in 2016, you can see again, the cost is approximately 1/2. This was swath grazed oats versus stockpiled forage, but the costs in this published report comparing oat swath grazing to stockpiled, then you look to the Western Beef Development Center and Dr. Kala Thunga and the work he did, and the stockpiled and control. And you can see the differences. There's a trend we're looking at, the potential for animals harvesting feed savings, but it's not as good. We'll talk about that in a second. The fact that the corn grazing, swath grazing barley versus dry lot green feed. And this was work done by Dr. Yossi in the fact sheet for the Western Beef Development Center in 2017. So we're still seeing at least $1 savings in spots and getting up there in higher amounts. What Dr. Barron found, which was very interesting in 2014 work, crop yield matters. And if you can get a high crop yield, you could see the corn with the high crop yield, the triticale versus barley versus the control. The fact is yield matters. The other thing that you're seeing here in crop residues, that work done in 2013 and 2012 on the corn varieties, remember, you can take a picture of this, you can look at the webinar later, residue supplement. The minute you're supplementing these cows, because the feed is not quality good enough, you run into costs that erode the savings pretty quickly. And that was something that Dr. Krause mentioned quite quickly afterwards. Corn the same, one variety versus the next. So I'm just going to roll to this one and pass it off to the crew. And I'll pass it off to Diane Westerlin, the manager of the Chinook Applied Research Association at Oyen. And she'll lead the charge from the Forage and Applied Research Association starting down in Oyen, what her producers are up to. I'll pass it to you, Diane.
Okay, well, just give us a second while we do a little bit of technical changes here. There we go. And Diane, you're still on mute, so if you want to take yourself off, that'd be great.
Sorry about that. Thanks
Yep.
very much, Grant and Dean. Yes, my portion of the presentation today is just going to look at stockpile forage, chaff bunches, and crop residue as some grazing options for fall and winter. And I am not progressing my slide. There we go. Sorry, not sure what our problem was there. So looking at stockpiled forage as a grazing option, sometimes it becomes it becomes an option out of necessity when people are short of feed resources, but it can also be part of that system that Grant talked about in looking at year-round or close to year-round grazing, and it can be something that is planned to let the cows do the harvesting and hauling, spreading those nutrients around, controlling input costs, and those winter feeding, the yardage things. So it typically has an important place in management of year-round grazing resources. So what exactly is a stockpile forage? Stockpile forage is any forage material left standing for grazing in late fall, winter, or even into early the next spring. It can be native grasses or domestic species, and it could be accumulation of current year's growth, or it could just be regrowth after an early spring grazing. As mentioned, it can be deliberate or part of your annual plan, or it can be accidental depending on access to new forage resources or just purely by necessity. Some things to consider are just the yield and quality, palatability, and grazing logistics. And ideally, making a plan ahead of time just makes it all roll together much more efficiently. Several years ago, we had done some evaluation of the nutritional value of some stockpiled forage options down here in East Central Alberta. We did some sampling in August and then followed by some sampling in October. So as would be expected, alfalfa has had some of the better quality feed during that August sampling period. Some of the grasses, were less than 8% protein at that point in time because, it was past their optimum stage of value, but still reasonable nutrition. The samples collected in October really illustrated that not all stockpile forage is created equal, and some retain value better than others. So as expected, the alfalfa, just because of leaf drop and just other maturities, the protein levels dropped significantly between August and October. Meadow brome, roughly half the protein value. Russian wild rye, and it's not a grass that's grown necessarily for forage in all parts of Alberta, but it is very drought tolerant. So down in our area here, it used to be quite a common grass. It retains its value, especially on those lower leaves well into the fall. Crested wheatgrass protein levels had dropped significantly in that as well. And looking at some native pastures, the protein levels in August were 6 and 7%, but the value retained into October still provided some fairly good forage there as well. Particularly with the mixed fescue, the drop in protein values was not near as high as some of the other grasses. I think the key to stockpile forage is, and looking at the values, you can see that, as we had discussed earlier, that some of those don't have the protein that a cow in mid-pregnancy really should have. They were less than 7% protein. But the difference, there's often a huge difference between what cows are actually selecting to graze and what a clip or a hand clip or person selection is going to give. So cows are going to select for higher quality forage, but this is only possible if there's sufficient volume out there. I think it's one of the big risks with looking at stockpile forage is trying to balance it right to the pound of forage, and you want to be able to give that cow sufficient volume so that she can do some selecting and so that there is some material left for catching snow and for helping provide that thatch for next year's crop. So higher quality if sufficient volume is available. And of course, it does depend on the conditions of the year and if there's water available close, what if snow and ice are issues, and sometimes depends on the cattle as well. Sometimes younger or maybe older cattle are going to have a little more trouble out in that stockpiled situation versus young healthy cattle that can cope quite well. Grazing chaff and crop residue. In years past, this was a huge part of an annual feeding system for a lot of operations. Back in the day, where most of the farms were a mix between cattle and crop focus, those double fields were a very important part of the annual grazing resource. But it is not without some challenges. It's been looked at as a free feed because really the focus was on the crop production and the leftover was there free for the taking. The best value, of course, though, is in when that material is gathered versus the cattle having to gather it themselves. So a little assistance on the gathering side just creates more value to the chaff and the crop residue. Years ago, these little chaff bunchers used to be pretty common among some of the small mixed farm operations. Another, probably 15, 20 years ago, Jim Hole and Alan Jones put together did a bit of engineering and created the chaff buncher, which just is on a much smaller scale than those larger chaff piles, and create some efficiencies. They don't have to be handled again. Once the material is gathered, it trips. It's just once a certain amount of weight is on the device, it just trips, and the material is in rows in the field and really easily accessed by the cattle. The value of chaff piles, Saskatchewan Agriculture put together some numbers here a few years ago on the volume of straw and chaff produced by a number of different crops. So this table is showing that with hard red spring wheat, for every bushel of wheat that's produced, there's roughly 50 pounds of straw and 20 to 25 pounds of chaff. Some of the other cereals, the amount of straw and chaff decreases just because of the nature, physiology of the plant, but still some significant amount of forage can be gathered up and utilized by cattle. The quality of chaff piles does depend on a number of things. You know, what the weed seed content is, how much grain is actually thrown over by the combine, whether it be just because of small kernel size or maybe an inefficient machine, and also the stage or maturity of the crop and when it was harvested. Typically though, the chaff and straw are low in protein and possibly low in calcium and magnesium. So supplemental protein and or energy might be required in some of these feeding situations. Doug Ray had done a presentation for us here in Oyen several years ago, and swath grazing and chaff-pile grazing are a big part of his winter feeding, and he was getting 90 cow days per acre on the residue left from a 70 bushel oat barley mix crop, and these were in chaff bunches, but I think that's a pretty efficient method of feeding and pretty good volume there. Of course, the aftermath is as I mentioned, a good opportunity, and ideally bunching it makes it a little more efficient for the cows to use, but you know, it often just becomes an opportunity just to let the cows graze on the aftermath without having that bunching happening. Again, here the quality does depend on what the crop was, the yield, the amount of grain thrown over, and how hard did the cows have to work for it. Like if it was, some of the newer combines chop the material up significantly more than the older technology did, so it's a little bit harder maybe for them to pick it up. Are there sloughs and headlands in those fields that also provide some value from other forages? But again, as mentioned with the chaff piles, some supplementation might be required because of the low protein and mineral levels. Some of the value of grazing crop aftermath too encourages sort of working with your cropping neighbor, because you can provide him some value by reducing excess straw, by spreading those nutrients around. So there can be value from both sides. Sometimes expense in fencing, water, or shelter might create a bit of an obstacle there, but I think with some proper planning, it can be beneficial to both sides. And also, I think it's important to remember, be prepared to supplement if need be. Understand what the value of the forage material, whether it's stockpiled or crop residue, what you are dealing with, and don't forget minerals and salt as well. And I guess just a couple other recommendations before I pass it on to Alyssa is, you know, feed sampling, if at all possible, just gives you some confidence in what you are dealing with. Keep in mind though, if cows have the opportunity and have the volume there, that they're probably going to select for a little higher quality than you're able to do in your grab samples to send off to the lab. Monitoring body condition is essential, I think, in any kind of winter grazing situation. Grant has mentioned in other presentations, that the condition of the cow going into the winter, so that you can harvest a bit off her back as well as the actual forage that they're consuming. But you can't let that get down too low, or you're going to potential problems with calving, rebreeding, and other issues down the road. Minerals and salt, of course, are important, and in some situations, shelter might need to be enhanced if natural shelter is not there. As Grant had mentioned as well, planning is an important part of the game, but flexibility is also important. So the plan may not be the same every year, but just looking ahead the best you can is important. And that's it for me. I'm going to pass it off to Alyssa now.
Thanks, Diane. Just give us a second here. We're going to do a little bit of a change to the presenter and bring up Alyssa, and we will let Alyssa take it away once, there she goes. She's available. So Alyssa, go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the introduction, Diane. I'm excited to be here this afternoon to be able to share a little bit about what we're doing in our region of Alberta, which is the northeastern region, particularly in the Bonnyville area. And I'm going to touch on a couple of different grazing systems, including corn grazing and bale grazing. So the first system that I wanted to touch on is corn grazing, which has been gaining significant popularity, particularly over the last decade. And in this region of Alberta, we've seen probably a doubling in the number of producers that are utilizing corn as a grazing system, and probably a tripling of the number of acres that have actually been grown by these producers. It can be a very rewarding system. It is also a little bit of a higher input system, just because of the cost of the corn seed and some of the inputs, including fertilizer as well as herbicide, to be able to maintain a clean field can increase some of the costs. Once we saw an increase in the number of producers that were utilizing corn, we conducted a survey that went from 2013 to 2016, assessing the yield and the quality of corn in the area, just to be able to give producers a bit of an understanding of where it sits when you're considering an extended grazing option for your operation. The first thing we looked at was the nutritional quality, and when you consider the general rules of thumb that you'll utilize when balancing a ration for your livestock is for crude protein, you want to have those levels at 7% in mid-gestation, 9% in late gestation, and 11% after calving. The average content that we got for crude protein was about 8.55, so you're right in the middle. And Diane had mentioned before, and so did Grant, about knowing when you're going to be grazing your animals. The closer you get to calving, the greater the potential is that you're going to have to be providing some sort of a supplement, and corn is going to be one of those grazing systems. It's a little bit opposite when you consider the energy content that you have within your corn crop, the easiest method to estimate that is through the total digestible nutrients. And the rules of thumb are to have it at 55% in mid-gestation, 60% in late gestation, and 65% after calving. So corn, because of the high energy that you find in mature cobs, the energy content is quite high. So you also need to be aware of the potential and the risk of acidosis. So you want to be able to calculate when you're putting those animals out, and to make sure that you're going to be practicing good practices when you're switching feed sources, so that you can try and minimize that potential risk. The fiber content that we found within the corn fields that we were sampling, and we sampled close to 50 different fields with the local producers in our area, was the average was quite consistent, but it did vary from year to year because corn requires a lot of heat units to be able to mature, and it has a longer season. There was a lot of variability in 2018. We had a lot of because of the forest fires in the northern parts of the province, we had a lot of smoke come down into our area, so that did cause a delay in some of the development. And then in this summer, we all probably a little bit different than a lot of other parts of the province, we had a really cool wet season, so that caused a little bit of a delay in maturity as well. But you want to just watch when you're taking your sample. If your fiber contents get a little bit too high, you could be minimizing your intake as well as the digestibility. And when you're looking at your corn, just going back to the risk of acidosis, is making sure that your animals are not hungry when they're going in, because they'll go for the cobs first and then the leaves and then the stalks. Diane talked a bit about the need for supplementing, and minerals is something that you're probably going to want to consider when you're grazing corn, particularly when it comes to calcium. And if you're going to be grazing your animals a little bit closer to calving, you're going to want to be including at least a 2-to-1 or a 3-to-1 calcium phosphorus mineral. A lot of the producers in our area are working directly with a nutritionist and creating a custom blend that is specific to their nutrition tests. Other producers are utilizing pre-mixed minerals, or they're also going to a pellet. So the pellet would include both a protein supplement as well as your mineral supplement. The second thing that we looked at when we did our survey was looking at the yield and grazing days that you're able to achieve. And we noticed a really big difference when you go from utilizing a conventional planter that has a 12-inch row spacing going up to a corn planter. You had about a doubling in the number of grazing days that you're able to achieve. A lot of producers don't have access to a corn planter with that 30-inch row spacing, so some of them are using a conventional air seeder, blocking off a couple of rows just to try and get that row spacing as close to 30 inches as you can. Corn is very, very uncompetitive even with itself, which is why that spacing is so important to be able to get proper development of the stalks and the cobs. And that is also why weed control is also really important, particularly in the early stages of growth, just to be able to have that proper growth. And the other difference when you go to a corn planter is the planter will space the seeds out within the row more evenly than you'll get with a conventional planter. When we looked at the yields, we had anywhere from about 2.8 tons per acre to 8.4 tons per acre, and the higher tonnage typically came from a greater row spacing or the use of a corn planter versus the conventional systems with the lower yields that we were ending up getting. Just going back to the field work that we did on the row spacing, is we worked with a producer that seeded that utilized a corn planter as well as a traditional planter, and they went from about 6 grazing days with the traditional seeder up to about 14. So they doubled their grazing days, and that was with 550 dry cows on 20 acres. And both Diane and Grant mentioned before is that proper planning is going to get you the rewards that you're looking for. You need to do your research, and I would highly encourage working with a local nutritionist, local applied forage or research associations that have access to different information, and also to do some experiments on your own farm as well. We've had some producers that are seeding anywhere from 2 different corn varieties up to 12 different corn varieties on the same field. And they can really notice which ones are going to be doing the best in their operation. And when they turn their cattle out, they also see which variety that their cows are going to first. So it's really, really helped them in determining which variety they're going to want to be growing. It's also really important, I think I mentioned before, is to know when you're planning on grazing. The closer that you get to calving, the higher the nutritional requirements are going to be. Most of the producers in this area are grazing them in early to mid gestation, although we have had some producers that are calving on corn. But you need to make sure that you're taking your forage test so that you know what you're grazing and what you're going to need to supplement. Because the last thing you want to have is to run into a disaster because you didn't do the research that you needed to do. Corn tends to be a high input crop, but we've had some producers in the area that have been growing corn on the same field over multiple years, or switching up between corn and a different extended grazing practice so that they continually get the nutrients deposited directly onto the field. And what some producers have found is that they can lower the requirements for fertilizer that they need in following years. So you can use it as a method of reducing some of your input costs as well. And fencing technique is really important in order to make sure that you're getting proper utilization of the feed. And most producers will utilize electric fencing and cross fence. And the picture on the slide here is showing one of our local producers that instead of having to drive posts into the ground in the middle of winter when the ground is frozen, he's used PVC pipe, cuts off the top of a corn stalk, and then just slides that PVC pipe over the corn stalk and uses that to hold up his electric fencing for winter. moving on to some information about bale grazing, and I was just going to touch briefly on this on some of the work that we've been doing, as Nora will also be talking a bit about what they've been doing up in the Peace region of the province. And there's a couple of different methods that you can use for bale grazing, and it's highly variable between the producers that we work with. You can do in more intensive methods, or you can do less intensive methods. So the more intensive methods tend to have about 25 bales per acre, and you're going to be grazing your animals for about 3 to 5 days. So with this system, you'll be using typically an electric fence to slowly move them down your line of bales, and the bales are typically placed about 40 feet apart. And one of the big benefits that you can get from using an intensive type system is that you're going to get a little bit more of an even distribution of nutrients from that bale grazing. Most producers notice that you get a real concentration right where the bale was, and that's where you'll get a lot of the larger growth of grass the following year. So the closer that you have those bales, the more even that growth will be the following year. You will just have to be moving those animals a lot more frequently. We worked with a producer who did a less intensive method where they only put about 2 to 5 bales per acre, which means that they were using having multiple weeks of feed at a time instead of moving them every 3 to 5 days. Some of the local producers will put their animals out in the morning and bring them back in at night using sleds or stock dogs. So they went out from about 9 till 4 every day. And the producers that we've seen utilizing grazes them for about 54 days when they're having that about 20 acres. And Grant mentioned earlier about waste, and that is probably one of the biggest questions that you get in some of these winter grazing systems, is how much are the animals actually going to be leaving behind? So we did do a 5-year study looking at wastage in bale grazing, because bale grazing has been used quite a bit, and there were a lot of producers asking. And so we looked at a less intensive method. So we were working with a producer that did the 2 to 5 bales per acre, multiple weeks of feed at a time, instead of doing a more intensive. And what we found overall over those 5 years was there was only an average of a 16% waste. So when you're comparing that to some of your other systems, particularly some traditional feeding systems that can have waste of higher than 19 to 20%, there really isn't too much of a waste within this system. We also looked at doing a side versus end placed bales. Most producers are using end placed bales, but we did notice, although our data number was small, that there was a little bit less waste when you did use a side placed bale. Another key point is that you're trying to minimize the number of times that you're going to be touching these bales. So when you're considering bale grazing on your operation, most of the producers in this area are taking the bales directly from the field that they've hayed and putting them out into that field that they're going to be bale grazing later, just trying to minimize the number of times you're touching that bale and minimize that fuel usage. And I just have a couple of pictures here of that less intensive method. It's a little bit different than what you typically see when you look at pictures of bale grazing, where you have nice, neat lines and rows of bales. And this system uses a really more of a random placement, and they're not in any straight lines. But I'm going to leave it off there and pass it on to Nora, and she's going to mention a little bit more about some bale grazing methods.
Okay, thanks, Lissa. We are going to pass this over to Nora. Just give us a second while we do a little technical change here. And just a reminder, if you have any questions, that you can type them into the GoToWebinar question panel, and we will get to them after the end of our presentations. So just waiting on Nora here. There we go. Okay, Nora, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Dean, and thanks, Grant, Diane, and Alyssa. My name is Nora Palovich, manager of the North Peace Applied Research Association, and we have our research farm just south of Manning, and we're located in the North Peace area. As Alyssa said, I'm going to talk a little bit about bale grazing. And I'm just having an issue, same as Diane did, in getting my slides to advance. My apologies. Not sure what I'm doing wrong, Dean.
Just bring your mouse over the there and click.
Oh, just click it onto the arrow.
Or just on the screen itself. Should bring up the and right click.
Okay. There we go. Sorry about that. So I will touch briefly on bale grazing and grazing annuals, which are two methods that producers in our area do use. We do have some folks that definitely do graze corn also. It's not as popular as the other methods. Bale grazing is something personally that my family and I have used for over 25 years. We try to set our bales out in the fall, and as Alyssa said, this minimal movement of the bales, so if you can take them straight from your hay fields to where you're going to graze them and get them set out in the field. Ideally, if we can, we'd like to remove the twines in the fall when they're not covered in snow and ice. And if you do set them on end, then it's easier to do, but setting them on the side, I believe the cattle do utilize the bales up better. We grow brome grass for seed production, so we will use the aftermath in our bale grazing program together with a good grass legume hay. So then we set them out in a 50-50 ratio. We find this works really well in using up that aftermath. We do set up a solar watering system some years, but if there's enough snow, we do not find that there's any problem in just using snow as our grazing source, as our water source. Some tools we find that make it a little bit easier. We used to use rebar, and as anybody that's tried that knows, they're a pain to pound in, they're a pain to remove. We've been using these fiberglass bale grazing stakes, and you can see the clip on the end there, and they just make bale grazing so much easier, and we just put them in every second bale in the row. And as Alyssa said, you can use whatever time that you want. You can give the cows enough bales for 3 or 4 days or up to a week. That's the beauty of bale grazing, is it gives you so much flexibility. I know everybody talks about waste. We find that this is one of the best methods of improving a poor producing pasture. So we just don't see that as waste. That is just nutrients being returned to the soil. So it is a great way to feed and a great way to improve your land. And again, flexibility is just awesome too. We use these rules of thumb when we're estimating how many bales to put out for our winter feeding program. We're saying about 20 cows can access a bale at one time. So if you are feeding a poorer quality feed and a higher quality feed, and you've got maybe replacement heifers and some timid cows, we want to make sure that they all can access the good feed and not just the boss cows. That's why we're estimating those 20 cows per bale. And then that lets you determine how many bales you need them to allow access to at one time. And we use the rule of thumb about 30 cow days per bale. So again, this is a popular method of feeding up here. There really is less risk with bale grazing. If you do get a lot of snow, those cows can always access those bales. Sometimes you might have to break a trail for them through the snow drifts, but they can still access those bales. Grazing annuals.
Nora, it's Grant here.
Yeah.
Does anybody have a problem seeing Nora's screen? Because I do. I just want to make sure no one else does.
I see that you clicked it off, so.
Yeah, I can't see it either.
Okay. You can see it, Dean?
Nope, nobody can see it.
Okay, so show screen.
Perfect.
Okay. So all
There,
those slides we missed?
You're back.
Okay, I'm good?
Yeah, you're good now. You want to? Yep.
Okay. So grazing annuals are also called cocktail cover crops or polyspecies cover crops, mixed annual forages. With grazing cover crops, we have diversity above ground and below ground because we are having usually cool season and warm season grasses and cool season and warm season legumes, so that we have different architecture of our leaves and stems capturing as much sunlight for photosynthesis as possible. And then we of course have the diversity of root systems down below, so that we have our tap roots and we have all our different rooting systems at different soil depths. Armor on the soil surface really depends on how you are your grazing management. You can leave as much or as little, but it is really good to leave as much as you can and have those cattle tramp that into the ground. And living roots into the fall. This is something, even if you're grazing your cover crops in July, August, or September, we're going to have some regrowth and you're going to have those living roots into the fall versus a monoculture, say cereal crop that you're swath grazing. Once you cut that, you're not going to have those living roots into the fall like you will with our cover crops. A lot of people are including some winter and fall crops in their mixes. And of course, you are integrating livestock. Benefits of grazing cover crops. They, the high nutritive quality because of the diversity within that, as I mentioned, legumes and grasses, you have a high protein and higher energy, and it is a more complete nutrition package than, say, a straight cereal in swath grazing. And it also maintains its quality. And with this higher quality, then that allows you to graze your cow-calf pairs into the fall and into the winter, and those calves will have equal access to all of this forage. There's definitely potential for regrowth. That lower right-hand picture is a brassica. After 2 nights of -8, there was regrowth. So no matter when you're grazing these, of course not in after October, but you will definitely be seeing some regrowth. And grazing annual cover crops definitely gives you versatility. You can graze it standing or you can swath graze. It all depends on how it suits your management system. And as with all of the options that Diane discussed, as did Alyssa, keeps the cattle out on the landscape, and that's what we want to do. And that can mean on your grain acres too. Grazing annual cover crops definitely improve soil health, and it's one more way to lengthen your grain crop rotation, also putting one more crop out there. There's so many different species to choose from, and we at NPARA, and I know other applied research associations and forage associations, are doing a lot of research on the different species available. Every year we do a crops garden, so we put in close to 50 different species in monocrops, so producers can come out and see what they look like, and they can see how well they are growing. And then we do many, many different mixes also and see how well they're doing and what resource concerns they are addressing. It's just important for us to see how these species are doing in our area of the world so that producers can come out and have a look at all our tours. And then we are measuring biomass and nutritive value throughout the season, and those results will be compiled so that you can have a look at those. This is an annual cover crop that was sown May 25th, and it's on rented land, so on a crop producer's land. He wanted to see a cover crop grown on there and then grazed by livestock. And so this land was rented. That was the mix put out there: oats, forage peas, hairy vetch, Italian rye, a forage rape, and turnip, sweet clover, and millet. And because this was on rented land and being seeded in May, the owner of the land did not want to see all those oats go to maturity, so that's why it was swathed. And you have to remember there are some risks in seeding all these different species. So if you do get a late spring frost, then that can harm your warm season grasses like the millets or the sorghum Sudan grass. And if there's some flea beetles, they definitely will eat some of your brassicas for sure. And we did have grasshoppers this year. They certainly did their share of munching too, but they left the peas alone. This is another producer in the area using cover crops. That is the mix that in this particular field, he put his pears out there and they grazed in September. And that was his estimate of production of 80 animal units per acre, and he left lots and lots of cover on there. This is another producer. He always uses oats as his main component, and he said this year, as I think everybody across the province has had a lot of rain, we were extremely dry until the beginning of July, and then the rains never stopped. He said his peas and oats were reaching 5 and 6 feet. And he will include other species in there like peas, clovers, vetch, turnip, kale, and radish. And this picture, he said he couldn't remember for sure when he seeded it, mid to late June, and then he will be grazing that standing until January. So, but as everybody said, we always have to have a plan C, B, C, or D, because as 2019 has certainly shown us, we just never know what Mother Nature is going to throw at us. But it's great to have all these options, from swath grazing to grazing annual cover crop standing to bale grazing and some of the other options that Diane had mentioned. And if we can use all these options to complement each other and come up with a grazing plan, I think it's great. But always have some stored feed on hand if possible. This year has certainly been a challenge for us up in the Peace and trying to get any stored forage put up. So we're seeing a lot of round bale silage put up this year, and it's just another tool in the toolbox that we'll be able to use. And over to Grant.
Good. Thanks, Nora. We're going to pass it over to Grant here for some closing comments.
All right, can you see the screen?
Yeah, you want to switch the display settings up on top, please?
How's that?
Perfect.
Awesome. We're not leaving you just here. There's been a lot of work done on extended grazing, and as Nora was sharing, and Alyssa and Diane, it's continual, it's ongoing. But there have been snapshots in time where we've really done our homework, and a number of us got together with the Forage and Applied Research Associations and Alberta Agriculture to meet with ranchers across the central area from Glendonald, Mayerthorpe, down towards the south. And it's a webinar series. Anyone can access it. Just type into a search engine, Alberta Ranchers Winter Grazing. If you type in Alberta Ranchers Winter Grazing, either the Lakeland Applied Research Association site or Alberta Agriculture YouTube site will pop up. Our West Central Forage, all partners in this project, and there are 47 videos on the varying types of work being done by producers, what they're finding, sharing those gems that you get only from being part of an association or talking to people in those associations, because learning together means sharing together, and we're very blessed and spoiled by that. So take advantage. This webinar series was done in 2016, so it's still very current. Beyond that webinar, The fact is, you getting the Beef Cattle Research Council, as many of you know, have been doing a wonderful job doing webinars, but on top of that, they've got the forage beef .ca website that they've incorporated into their work. They've got extended grazing as part of it, with some videos, with content and everything, key knowledge nuggets and everything. So beyond just the webinars they put on in the winter, where we see them on Thursday nights at 7 o'clock, once a month or twice a month, depending on circumstances, you can take advantage of their website for more information as well. Beyond that, just letting you know, this webinar series is getting recorded, and there will be more coming as we look to November 21st, December 5th, and we're looking to the new year. So the planning team will be getting back together to see what else. But these sets of webinars dealing with bale silage and silage, certainly looking at feed waste. Barry Uremcio and Karen Lindquist are going to be parts of those ones. And Barry did his master's thesis on feed waste. So he's got, like Alyssa shared, she worked with him in some parts of that. So you've got some really good information coming. The Alberta Beef Forage and Grazing Center, the old Western Forage Beef Group that got converted over time to the very active Alberta Beef Forage and Grazing Center, is doing a number of things. They're up on Twitter and can be found and followed in light of the research that's being done and other things. And I know that Diane and Karen Lindquist and Barry and others sit on that team, along with a bunch of producers. So a number of things coming, and research directed by input from those players. The Ag Info Center is available, and that phone call is just 310 farm. There is, in my own mind, a real challenge in agriculture, be it the weather from this fall, be it from agriculture challenges in general. And don't feel that you're alone in this. That's one of the beauties I find of going to a Forage and Applied Research Association meeting, is I get together with a whole bunch of my peers that think like I do. I know that's scary, folks, but take advantage of that. Take advantage of the Saskatchewan Ag Knowledge Center. There are stress and helplines. We get our oil changed in our cars. What if we need our own oil changed? I don't think that hurts. I myself have taken advantage of stress or a counselor. If you need it, do address it, because families are important and the future of agriculture is important. And we're looking at family farms and the importance of them. There are a number of associations around the province, and you did hear from Diane from Chinook Applied Research Association. You also heard Alyssa at Lara, and you also had Nora from NPARA. So a few of the many that are present there with the phone numbers and everything for key contacts to follow up with. Give them a phone call, find out what they're up to, and tap into them. The other thing I would say, I'll flip back, but the other thing I would say is, when trying something, one of the people said to me, and it was, of course, it's a farmer from Three Hills, Glenn Stankovich, but he said, if you haven't tried something 3 times and tried each time using what you've learned from it to do it better, as Alyssa shared, the differences between 12-inch row spacings, 30-inch row spacings with corn, he said to the group, you haven't tried it. The fact is, don't put all your eggs in one basket. And you've got a number of options out there. The beauty of what we're seeing and coming up in the Soil Health Western Canada Conference on Soil Health and Grazing, it's sold out. So it tells you how farmers and ranchers are viewing the importance of dealing with it. We can have our cake and eat it too. We can have healthier soils. We can have a healthier future. But that, a lot of it comes from strong people and people realizing that people need to be nurtured, not just systems and ideas. So I'm going to stop there and pass it back to Dean if there's any questions or such.
Good, thanks, Grant. like to thank, first of all, before we hit some questions here, there's a lot of information there, excellent presentations. So, you know, if people on the webinar are going to view it later, you know, these people are experts in their field. Make sure you get a hold of them if you got any questions after the webinar. So if everybody wants to unmute, I can ask the question because we have one so far. And this person says, I have a neighbor that didn't get his oats combined. If I wanted to swath graze the crop, what is the feed value of a ripe crop and how could you estimate the crop value?
Well, I guess I can give a couple comments on that. I think the best way to totally understand the value is to actually take a feed sample and have it analyzed. But mature oats do make good grazing. Sometimes the straw isn't as you know as desirable as if it was cut when it was a little bit greener. But I think it can still make good feed.
Yeah, and I certainly agree with that. Just they're probably going to eat the heads mainly and not the straw, but I agree with Diane. Make sure you get a feed tested.
We do graze crops that are quite mature at times. That's why swath grazing got started in the first place. And so the reality is adjust them to it, realizing that they're going to eat the heads, as Diane said. So do you want them to eat all the heads in the field? And my concern with that is if they're going to be eating bushels of oats on day one, I'd still be a little careful getting them started. Whether you choose to put some supplemental feed, hold them back, adjust their rumens 3 to 5 days more maybe so that they can tolerate it. Allot them in sections so that you're going to get more grazing days from it. I know the questions that have been coming into the Forage and Applied Research Associations or into the Ag Info Center or it's the Sask Forage Ag Knowledge Center have been asking about this. The cost and how to determine it is based on how well they clean up too, because you can, of course, get a lot of grazing days out of it if it's judiciously managed. Or you can graze a lot of heads and leave a lot of straw behind. So as cost per grazing day, look at the costs of what it would cost to feed cows. Then you've got to realize if the cows have to be trucked there and other things. So call Ted or Dean at the Ag Info Center and they will help you with some of those thoughts and working it through, or take advantage of your Forage and Applied Research Associations.
Anybody else have any more comments?
Alyssa, are you running into that up your way?
A little bit, but we've actually been a little bit lucky with getting a few of the crops off in terms of the cereal crops. So there's not as much sitting out for this year. But I would definitely say it would be a good feed source. But as you said, make sure you're transitioning those animals in a logical way so you're going to avoid any sort of disaster that might happen.
And you're looking at grain quality, straw quality, and you're roughly with oats, it's probably about 60% straw, 40% grain. So you can do a guesstimate of some yields there. And as Diane said, pick from the swaths some plants to send away if you wish, and doing that and bring them to the house and cut them up and into small little chunks. And if you've got 25 plants, there's different ways people approach it. But when you ask the researchers at Lacombe how they will sample their swath grazing, they split the swath apart. They grab 1 or 2 or 3 plants, and then they go to another spot in the field and do the same. And in the end, when they've got a good representative set of plants from varying parts of the field, take it in, chop it up, put it in a bag, and take it right in to get sent away and get analyzed for yourself. And then you know what you've got. And as Diane commented, when the cattle are given the selection opportunity, they're going to select the higher quality first. So the fact of what the ration is, if you've got all the straw and stem in there, might not be, it's going to be a lot higher quality if the animals aren't rationed on it.
And if you need assistance in getting the feed analyzed, I know we facilitate getting samples sent off to some of the commercial labs for that for the feed analysis, and the turnaround time the last few weeks has been very quick. Usually a week or less, we're getting that analysis back.
Good, thank you. We don't have any other questions right at this minute, so I'm going to give another minute here. If there's any other comments that any of our speakers want to make, please do so, and we'll give a minute for some questions.
It is a balancing act, and as one of our good friends, Doug Ray, says, stick handling through it. The returns, as we showed from the economic side, but even beyond that, as one person said, when you watch the video series, you'll even hear the person, Jess and Cindy Hudson from Bashaw, saying we can visit our families at Christmas time. We can go to our kids' volleyball games or basketball in their case, 4-H meetings and other things. So it is a lot of planning and thinking and putting contingencies in place, but then it allows a lot of time on your time and time for families too. So, and as Alyssa shared, the waste is surprisingly not as much as people think. And with that in mind, you'll want to listen to Barry's webinar a couple of weeks down the road, but the fact is your management determines a lot of that waste too. But it depends is the answer, as many of you know, in farming. And the beauty of a lot of these systems is the synergy of the urine and manure going back on the landscape and the land getting better over time, using forages that are high quality to be a supplement. As Nora shared, those cocktail cover crops in an adjoining field on a neighbor's cropland to your field that's in straw chaff bunches, my goodness, you can ration one to the other and graze all winter, even through the snow with that. So take advantage of those windows of opportunity for the supplements to be low-cost supplements and judiciously done so that you truly are ahead of the game and monitoring those cows so the condition doesn't slip and you don't get surprises.
No, that's a good summary, Grant. I think we just need to encourage everyone to look at it as part of a system rather than individual components that are standalone.
And with the advent of electric fencing, it just is easily done.
And as Alyssa taught us, I guess you can buy a border collie or maybe a snowmobile, a snow machine, and write it off on the farm.
Okay, no other questions come in, so I think with that we are going to close off the webinar. So once again, I'd like to thank all of our presenters for an excellent overview and presentations. And as mentioned before, the webinar is being recorded and you'll receive a link to the webinar tomorrow. So with that, we're going to close out, and thank you and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dean.
Thanks, Dan, Dean.